Welcome to the Northern Myths Podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
Today, we're happy to invite onto our show Lee Accomando, the host of the Viking Age Podcast, one of the longest-running, well-established shows that has really paved the way for us to be able to take advantage of the audience for Norse and Viking-themed podcasts. So we're very excited to have Lee on with us today to be able to tell us and to tell you about his great show.
Yes, it's going to be a great conversation. He gets into a pretty interesting history stuff with the Vikings, like really captures a glimpse of what life was like back then. So it should be very interesting. And I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, definitely. And he's even been doing a lot of great series now, a little more on specific topics. I know he's doing the Eastern Vikings for a while there, and now he's doing the life of Gunnhild, Konungamother, but we'll see and certainly have to ask him a little bit more about those series and what all he's been up to. So yeah, I hope you enjoy hearing about his show as much as we enjoy listening to it. Okay, before we get into that and get Lee on the show, do want to mention here we are sponsored by Grimfrost. Grimfrost is our absolute favorite source for Norse and Viking merchandise and products. They've got basically anything you can think of related to the Norse and Vikings, and they got some fantastic historical reproductions based on actual Viking Age finds, which is really awesome, as well as some awesome contemporary stuff, which is really cool, whether it's shirts or gym gear or beard care products or drinking horns or cool premium items that are really unique. They've got basically anything you can think of if it's related to Norse and the Vikings, and they're just really fantastic. We're huge fans of theirs. We have been even since before we started the show. And the best thing about them is that just like what we're doing, they aim to build a bridge between the past and the present, bringing relevant parts of the Old Norse culture into today's world.
Yeah, Grimfrost is awesome. They also generously provided us with our new intro music and outro music. Really, we couldn't be happier to be sponsored by them because it's just such a match made in heaven, or Valhalla, I guess, for us. But it really, we're just thrilled. It's really amazing to be partnered with them. So absolutely check them out, grimfrost.com.
Grimfrost.com, yeah, to see everything they have available. Check them out there. And the other way that you can support the show, the main way you can help support the show, is on our Patreon. We're at patreon.com/Northern Myths. And every little bit of support towards the show goes towards making this a better production. We're trying to upgrade a few bits of our hardware and our software to make producing this show an even better quality than we are now, and to make editing it a little bit easier, and just to make sure we have all the right equipment to do this the best we possibly can, including things like we're working towards a mixer that'll help to record directly onto the hardware there, as opposed to relying exclusively on software for the recording. So even though that may sound a little mundane, it's going to be the springboard for the future for getting us even better, and to make sure that we are making good backups and things like that, as important as that stuff is. So yeah, if you just go over there to the Patreon, you can support us if you like. We try and make as much value for our patrons as possible, including early access to episodes. Basically, as soon as I'm done editing them, I upload them to Patreon, as well as we try and go a little bit behind the scenes for what we're doing with the show, updates early on news about the show. Basically, as soon as anything is confirmed, we say so on Patreon. And yeah, that's just one great way you can support the show and be in closer touch with us, so we can help to make this even more valuable for you, the listener. And speaking of ways to get in touch with us, we are on all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're Northern Myths or Northern Myths Podcast on all platforms. We're also personally on Twitter at NorthMythLuke and at NorthMythDan. And we always appreciate comments, shares, reviews. All this stuff is just really great, helps support the show. A review on iTunes, a 5-star review on iTunes is especially helpful to us. I wish I didn't have to say that it's 5 stars, the thing that's the most helpful, but everything else it lowers our average instead of increases it. So that's the best way you can help us, is to give us a 5-star review. You can also go over to our YouTube channel, and even if you only listen to us on the podcast, if you go over to YouTube and give us a subscribe, that's another way you can help us to grow. All of these things just help us out. And if you've been enjoying the show, just these little things, if you want to take a minute to go on YouTube and subscribe, or write us a short review wherever you listen to your podcast, there are great ways to help us. And of course, again, you can support us further monetarily on Patreon if you so choose. I think that's about it. And of course, we'll recap this at the end of the show, but shall we get Lee onto the show?
Yeah, I think we should welcome Lee onto the show.
Okay. Lee, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Northern Mist podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, guys.
Well, this has been definitely something we've been looking forward to. You're one of the longest running shows kind of in this space, and you certainly paved the way for us in terms of getting our show into a already established community. So first of all, thank you for that. And do you want to just tell us and our listeners a little bit about yourself and about the Viking Age podcast?
Absolutely. So I'm Lee, for anyone who doesn't know. I'm the host of the Viking Age Podcast, which over time has grown into this sort of eclectic collection of deep dives into different topics from history and literature from Northern Europe in the Viking Age and early medieval period, which was not at all what I really intended when I got started. I thought it was going to be much more focused than that. But yeah, so I myself I have no real formal background in any of this. I'm a chemist by education and a web developer by trade. But I've always really loved history and just kind of loved the Viking Age and got into it and learned as I went. And the result was sort of the Viking Age podcast.
So when you were first originally decided to do a podcast and you took that crazy leap, what focus did you originally have in mind for it?
So when I first was thinking about it and getting started, I was really inspired and sort of was basing the idea on, shows like Mike Duncan's History of Rome and Revolutions, and particularly the British History podcast by Jamie Jeffers. And so the way those shows work and the way I had it in mind at the time was to do sort of a chronological exploration of what happened during the Viking Age, as far as we could tell, with a fairly heavy focus on how we know what we know, how we don't know what we know, which is most of it, and really coming at it through that lens.
So this is probably going to be the question here all the time, but why Vikings?
So why Vikings is kind of a complex question, because part of it is just, it always sort of connected with me, and couldn't exactly say why. But I've always loved history, studied all different types. And then I really sort of got into the Viking Age as a period after reading the Last Kingdom series, which is a historical fiction series of novels by Bernard Cornwell about the great heathen army and then King Alfred and his reconquest of Wessex and then conquest of England. It's a fantastic book series. There's a great show now. Highly recommend it to everyone. And it was really those books that got me into the Viking Age as a period, because Bernard Cornwell sort of does this great job of presenting this very 3D fascinating image of the period beyond just violence and raiding and trading, but all of these, tensions with religion, tensions with questions of identity. And that really intrigued me. And then I started sort of reading the intro books. The Age of the Vikings by Anders Winroth is one of my favorites, and was really just captured by how complex and interesting this period was, especially compared to, I think, what people's general idea is, that it's, these barbarians coming down from the north and raiding and destroying things, which is true. That's not wrong. but there's just a lot more going on there. And that was really what captured my interest.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see. We all have that image of the Viking being that barbarian who comes to your island and swoops in and steals all your women and burns everything. But at the same time, there is this sort of intricate culture with its own societal norms and all that going on sort of back home. And we often don't necessarily see that.
Right. And, one of the difficulties is trying to sort of tear back that curtain historically is pretty hard. There's not a ton of written sources from the period itself. So it's sort of playing detective work with the sagas and, what in here might have reflect customs that actually occurred during the Viking Age. Archaeology helps a lot, but just sort of doing that detective work to figure out what it was that motivated this behavior.
Yeah, the historical side of it is something that we don't do kind of the legwork on that, but it's impressive to be able to tease that stuff apart. And we, of course, approach it from a different angle in terms of the symbolic implications of some of these stories, but the actual historical implications for what our various sources have, that stuff is definitely impressive to be able to dig into that. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about how you got into doing all this history stuff on what I assume is just your spare time, if that's not your profession?
Yes, very much so. First of all of it is really detective work done by other people. I sort of think about what I do as trying to take together and synthesize the work that's been done by, historians, archaeologists, historians of religion, who are really out there doing the amazing work to tear back this curtain and try to understand these people, this culture, as well as what actually happened and what didn't happen. But for me, I just sort of approached it, kind of blind going in. I had no idea how much I didn't know when I first started. But the way I sort of go about it is, I think about it as sort of a funnel going down of when I start to approach a new topic, when I'm thinking about a new series, start as broad as possible. So going back to those sort of the original books that I started with, the 1-volume survey histories, get an idea of, the area we're talking about, the people we're talking about, and a high level idea of roughly what people agree on right now. And then basically play the reference game and just bring my way down. So getting into papers, getting into focused books when they're possible, those are always the best. And just trying to figure out, okay, what is the consensus right now? What are people arguing about? That's always a really interesting one of whenever you find an idea that's interesting, trying to go out there and find a paper or a book by someone who disagrees with it. And then try and just slam it into some sort of story to make it interesting to listen to while doing some education.
Yeah, that's the great thing about this medium is that it really does seem that there are people who want to learn and who want to develop this education, and then getting it summarized by someone like yourself who's able to actually take all this information and get it into a good format and easy to understand format. It's valuable to be able to do that. So why do you think learning history and knowing about history is, at the moment, it seems to be fairly popular, but even just for yourself as well, why do you think learning about history and digging into history is important?
That's obviously a really big question. I think, answers on a lot of different levels. For the one, just sort of fundamental one for me personally is it's just fascinating that I sort of never cease to just be so thrilled when I, come across a story or an idea or a theory that I've never heard of before. And digging into it and just learning about the ways we think about the past, the way the past is presented, and how that has changed over time. Just on a fundamental level, I find that really interesting. So I think I'd be doing this even if there wasn't sort of a greater reason. But luckily, I do think there is sort of greater reasons to study history. One of them is, I think, to help put our present in context. Something that over the course of creating the podcast has sort of struck me is how, history is really the study of the stories we tell ourselves about how the past was like. And we can tell more or less accurate stories. Understanding the stories that we've told ourselves in the past, understanding why we're telling ourselves the stories we're telling ourselves now, and seeing how those connect is just, I think, really interesting and really helps to put our present world in context, as well as helps you evaluate events that are happening right now and the way we talk about those.
Yeah, the way history presents itself, it's almost like what's the saying? Like, if you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. Something like that. That's the general saying, and certainly I agree on that point as far as history being something that is valuable to know for that reason. And maybe on a slightly different note, then, why do you think it's the Viking Age is so popular, that there is this audience for this? Because it's not just your show, it's all the other shows in the space, and it's the TV show Vikings, and it's The Last Kingdom, and they're popular, they're legitimately popular. Do you have any idea why that might be the case?
So it's always been very interesting to me that is the case, that the Vikings are such a popular topic, and they remain such a popular topic. Like you said, the sort of amazing ecosystem of podcasts about the Viking Age and about Norse myths and all of these things that have come up recently. The Vikings TV show Last Kingdom is another great example. I think, obviously, it means different things to different people. I think, first of all, there's just something fundamentally interesting and inspiring about the adventurous barbarianness there of, I think, oftentimes representing Vikings as these sort of hardy adventurers going out raiding, pillaging, exploring, discovering the new world, settling in new places. And I think those sort of stories are always really intriguing. And I think they resonate with a lot of the other stories that we tell ourselves. So, I think for instance, when I was doing a series on the settlement of Iceland, when I was sort of looking over my notes and looking over my scripts, I was realizing that I was using all of this language that, as an American, I usually associate with the frontiers of America, which was kind of an interesting realization there. So I think there's a lot about the Viking Age that resonates with other things that we know and other things we've learned, and just presents it in this really intriguing package of these ideas about, freedom and mobility and changing, and then just the kind of outlaw breaking the rules are always really intriguing stories. And I think all of that kind of comes together in the Viking Age, and I think it's at least part of the reason that people are so interested in it.
Do you have any particular stories that really excite you, or like any favorite stories of the ones you've read and covered?
I have so many of them. As anyone who's listened to my podcast knows, brevity is not exactly my thing. But I think I'll go with the Iceland theme here, of one of my favorite just kind of goofy stories, which almost certainly isn't true, but that doesn't particularly matter, is this story of the first person to reach Iceland on purpose, who is a man named Floki, who then became known as Raven Floki for reasons that will become obvious. Basically, there had been some people who had been blown off in storms and ended up in Iceland by accident, sort of looked around and returned to Norway or Sweden, wherever they were from originally, and were sort of spreading the word, talking about this island that's out there. And so Floki gets word of this, and like any good Viking, decides to put some people on his ship and go and find it. And his navigational method that he chooses is bringing 3 ravens with him. And so he sails from Norway to the Faroe Islands, stays over there for a little while, and then sets off to try and find Iceland. And sailing for a couple days, and releases one of the ravens. And it kind of goes up into the air, and then flies right back towards the Faroe Islands. So he knows he's not close. They sail on for a couple more days, release another raven, flies up into the air, and then just comes right down to the boat. There's no land anywhere nearby. A couple more days go, they're starting to get nervous. They release that third raven, it goes up and flies west towards Iceland, and they end up finding it, going around, and spending the winter there. And Floki is the one who is then credited with actually calling it Iceland. It had a couple of names before then by previous people who had found it. It's just kind of a goofy story, but for some reason it's really, I think it captures a lot of that adventure of the Viking Age, as well as just this goofy raven theme that I just really enjoy.
Yeah, that's pretty neat with the with using the ravens to sort of figure out how far away from land or how close to land you are.
Exactly. And I think also it's sort of one of those things that I know I get asked by people just in my life when they find out I know about Viking things of, how navigation worked. And we really don't understand that right now. And so I love that this story sort of hints at a little bit of that, because in general, navigation is just a topic that's sort of taken by granted in most of the sources we have. So we actually understand it. We don't understand it very well.
Well, of course, this Floki character has now been popularized on the Vikings TV show.
Yes.
But that they're not quite so close to this source that you're mentioning. It's not exactly the same story. But the entire reason for going out and finding a new place, though, that's something quite significant. And I think it's probably similar to that frontier spirit you talked about, as far as people just go into the unknown and try to find something valuable to bring back from that. And the reward in this particular case was the discovery of an entire new land that would eventually result in an extremely rich literature, all these fantastic stories, of course, a new place to live. At the time, it wouldn't have necessarily been the most hospitable place, and maybe on some level it never has been exactly, but maybe that's part of the allure and the reason why Iceland is so memorialized and has really become a place where all of this culture is so well preserved. And I like that particular story talks about the idea of just going into the unknown almost just for the sake of doing it. And I guess he knew that something was there, but he didn't have to go look for it and find it. And just that particular spirit is very admirable.
Very much agree. And I also agree that I think that's one of the big parts of that allure, is just capturing that spirit that you can see, as you guys know oh so well, that we see that in the history, and we also see the same ideas reflected in mythology, that Odin is always going out into the unknown to get things, get knowledge, and bring it back to civilization, for lack of a better word. And sort of that consistent theme that we see echoed throughout.
I would love for them to find a manuscript that shows that Floki was like, the only reason I wanted to go out and find this land was so that there'd be a TV character about me. That'd be pretty great. Spoiler alert for viewers of Vikings, but that'd be funny. It'd just be like, this guy was onto something.
He was really ahead of his time. He's like, I'm going to be memorialized by a TV show. I'm going to have crazy tattoos. It's going to be great.
That was a slow play too. It was not like the character initially. It was completely obvious that that's going to be the destination of that character on the TV show as well. So it's not like it was immediately obvious from the first season or something like that would be exactly what would end up happening with the character. Same thing with Rollo, sort of, even though that was pretty obvious that if you knew the history, what was going to happen, but just because they were compiling so many different characters from inside the Viking Age into one narrative, that they ended up, that there was sort of some misdirection and some backstory that isn't necessarily historical. But we were actually, when we had the guys from Saga thing on, John and Andy, they made an awesome point about the Vikings show that was really cool, as far as how the stories in the sagas were a different storyteller's way of remembering those different stories, and every time they would tell it, it would be from someone's different perspective or something like that. And so Vikings is just a different take on the story of Ragnar. And honestly, that just really, first of all, helps me appreciate it despite its historical inaccuracy, but it's also just a really great point as far as, yeah, it's actually just a different way of telling it. And so you can just go and enjoy it and have a good time with it.
Right. And taking these traditions and making them immediate and current and meaningful for us today, which is, I loved that point of it's exactly what the saga authors were doing. It's exactly what the generations before them had been passing around these tales in whatever form they were in before they were written down. And that's definitely something that I think, changed my mind on a little bit as I've learned more of. I think when I first started the podcast, I was kind of preoccupied with, what actually happened? How do we know that? And over time, as I've learned more, have really come to appreciate these different traditions, different stories that, reflect people's ways of understanding the past, of dealing with the past, of making it immediate and present. And I love sort of tying Vikings into that tradition.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know your show has been doing some things lately that are a little bit different from exactly what you started. I know you were doing numbered episodes for a long time, but then since you transitioned to some different themed episodes, now it's taken on a little bit of a different flavor, I suppose. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe the decisions behind the show's focus and what you've been up to lately?
Absolutely. So, yes, there's been a big shift and sort of ongoing. It will continue, I'm sure. That, first of all, there was a shift quite a while ago from this sort of chronological history that I started. That was, the shows that were the inspiration did that. So I was like, oh, that's the way to approach the Viking Age, of course. And as I learned more and, read different things, got intrigued by different things, realized that, at least for me personally, just wasn't the approach that I wanted to take anymore. So what I've started doing is much more of a scattershot approach of focusing on different topics for shorter periods of time, sort of. I do what I can, pretty long-winded. So, started with the beginning of the Viking Age, before the Viking Age, did a series on the Vikings in Ireland, which was really good. And then was going to move on to sort of the Vikings in continental Europe. Ended up taking a detour, talked about Iceland and Harald Fairhair, and incorporating sort of more saga narratives and, how we can use the sagas to understand how medieval Icelanders thought about this past. And the realization that in itself is a fascinating topic. The fact that they're not necessarily trustworthy historical sources is sort of besides the point. The stories themselves are really interesting, and they tell us a lot about the way people in the 1300s thought about their own past. And I would say that's probably my biggest inflection point on the show. And that was just sort of me personally learning more and getting interested in different things. And so I'm continuing to do that now. We're in the middle of a series about Gunnhild, Mother of Kings, who is a character from a lot of the king sagas. She was a queen of 10th century Norway and is just this like horrible villain in so many sagas. And so we're exploring her through the lens of the way other women in the sagas are described, both positively and negatively, to kind of explore this relationship that the saga authors had, which is different in every saga, with women and power, and really teasing out that just the way these stories are portrayed, the way these characters are portrayed, which is such a different thing. I never thought I would be doing that, but it's really interesting. And I've really enjoyed sort of the freedom on the show of removing from sort of a strict chronological narrative to exploring ideas and topics sort of as they're interesting to me. And, not everyone has loved it, but I think in general, a lot of people have appreciated that and appreciated diving deep into these stories.
That's awesome. You can't please all the people all the time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think one of a realization for me at one point was, if I'm not enjoying making the content's just going to be bad. So, you want to be understanding, you want to explore topics that people want you to explore. But at the same time, if you're not jazzed by that at the moment, content's not going to be great. So you just have to kind of go with what interests you, and the results kind of speak for themselves.
Definitely. So this Mother of Kings, you said Gunnhild?
Yes.
What are some of the things that she's done that make her particularly villainous?
There's so many great things. So we think, just do a quick little sketch here we think she was probably a Danish princess who married the son of Harald Fairhair, who's recognized as the first king of Norway. And she seems to have, in all of the traditions we have, had quite a bit of power. She was very influential, both over her husband, and then her sons end up taking the Norwegian throne after a lot of twists and turns. And it seems that she was quite influential both during Eric Bloodaxe, who was her husband's reign, and the reign of her sons. So that's what we could say probably, if she existed, which is a question, that's probably, kind of the basis. And then Icelandic authors who were writing, 200 years or so after she ruled, tack on all of these kind of wonderful villainous stories. So there's a great one where during the reign of her son, Harald Greycloak, this is in Njal's saga, one of the protagonists, man named Hrut, travels to Norway to claim some inheritance that he has, and goes to the court and ends up catching the eye of Gunnhild. And so she kind of takes him under her wing, advocates for him at court. She brings him into her bed, basically orders him, and then threatens to kill her guards if they ever say anything about it, which is just wonderful. And then things resolved. Hrut's getting ready to leave. He lies to her, saying that he's not returning to a woman when he actually is. And she gets all vengeful and places this curse on him that he'll never find satisfaction with this woman that she lied to him about. And it's just kind of this great combo of this very powerful woman acting independently, taking actions on her own terms, and then because of that, this negative portrayal around it as this seductress and this vengeful figure.
So what do you see as the interpretation of that? Like, are you saying that the way this is being portrayed is perhaps unfair to Gunnhild?
I would, yes, overall. Obviously, we can never know. The sources just aren't there to know even if Gunnhild existed, but what she was actually like. But what we sort of see, and this is sort of what we explore in the series, is parallels between the stories that are told about Gunnhild, the way she's portrayed, and the way other powerful women are portrayed. There's definitely no one way about it. There's, different figures have different portrayals, but there's definitely a tendency to demonize and vilify powerful women in the sagas, as there are in lots of literary traditions. It's certainly not unique. You can think of the evil stepmother motif as the kind of most common. I would say, odds are that the historical Gunnhild, if she existed, was probably not nearly so bloodthirsty and cruel as she is portrayed in the sagas. But she likely was a powerful woman who took a significant amount of power. And that's likely one of the reasons that the authors are seeking to give her a bad reputation.
Sure. And I mean, maybe devil's advocate here a little bit. What's wrong if she is bloodthirsty and cruel? I mean, there's plenty of male characters that are that as well. So what's wrong with a powerful woman also having those characteristics?
Nothing wrong at all. But the sort of interesting way is the way she is portrayed, and her actions are portrayed negatively, where, exactly as you said, male characters who are similarly bloodthirsty and conniving are not necessarily portrayed negatively in the same ways. That in some cases they're praised for their violence and bloodthirst, where Gunnhild tends to be vilified for it.
And I think you've already alluded to this a little bit, but do you have any idea why exactly that would be the case?
So, the simplest answer is just good old sexism. It exists today. It certainly existed in the past. We explore this as part of the series that the North in the Viking Age was definitely a patriarchal society. It was arranged in such a way that women were not allowed the same opportunities for public power as men were, in most cases. But the other thing that you realize through studying this, Gunnhild being a great example, is just because society in general was structured that way, exceptional figures can always get power and influence, maybe not in the same way. A woman might have to do different things than a man would to attain that power. In the end, that is definitely possible, but you do see in the literature in general, and again, there's plenty of positive portrayals of powerful women in the sagas as well, but the much more common thing is seeing a woman who's attained power that these societies in general say they shouldn't have, ends up leading to more negative portrayals than men in similar positions of power receive.
Yeah, that's an interesting analysis on that because, I mean, first of all, I think you already mentioned that it is subjective and it is not necessarily, we don't know exactly what happened and what is true, but if you're looking at it from a whole perspective on that and what is positive and what is negative, certainly I think that's something we'd like to know more about. And we haven't really dug too much into the sagas ourselves. We'd like to one day, but on one level, we're sort of leaving it to the great guys at Saga Thing to cover the sagas on sort of a base level as far as podcasts go, and then you've been bringing in a whole lot more about the sagas into your show lately. So I think the Icelandic ones are covered fairly well, but it's also an area that certainly I'd like to know more about from our perspective. Now, maybe shifting gears just slightly on this question is, as you've been incorporating the sagas and other things like that into your show that aren't necessarily as completely historical, how have you changed your approach to how you present this information?
Yes, and that's been a tough one. So generally what I try and do, and this is always a really hard balance to strike, is approaching these stories as they exist, and then trying to sort of, with the existing caveat of there's no way to say how true or false this is. We can approach it from a perspective and say, this sort of thing, we see this echoed in many different sources. And so there might be some, grain of truth here, or this is certainly a tradition that existed in medieval Iceland, and there's likely something to that. So there's the one approach of sort of looking at the stories themselves, talking about them, exploring them. And I think that's very useful just from they're great stories. And then, and this is something Saga Thing is great at as well, is do we see this in multiple different traditions? Do we see some of the same themes that even if we can't say specifically these events happened or, this happened in exactly this way, if we see things multiple times echoed throughout, we can say that this was certainly a tradition that was current when the sagas were being written down, and likely does reflect at least something which occurred in the past. And that is really interesting and can help us to sort of understand, what these societies may have been like. At the very least, it can tell us a lot about what people in medieval Iceland thought the Viking Age was like, which in many ways is as close as we can get, and is a hell of a lot closer than we are. So I think that alone is really interesting in sort of shifting that focus of, we might not be able to get at any sort of absolute capital T truth, but we can get to what people 200 years removed thought happened.
Yeah, so when you take that into the context of the Gunnhild character, it's almost as if she has become mythologized in a certain sense, because if there's that time removal before being written down, then the story of how she actually lived, maybe it loses some of that historical significance, but then she becomes essentially a mythological character who certainly may have existed and done many of the same things, but takes on a different level almost in her actions and the symbolism involved there. Do you make any distinction between those elements that are not necessarily historical and the things that you know as fact? And how do you deal with that distinction?
Generally, I just try to be as straightforward and honest as I can be about how well we know any particular piece of information. Because I find sort of going beyond that is a little bit beyond my capabilities as a researcher, and often beyond sort of what the evidence can offer. So we'll usually just kind of add caveats of, we see this trend, this is our best understanding of how X or Y happened, or the, way pagan worship may have gone down. We have accounts in the sagas about various sacrificial feasts that happen. And we can explore all of those portrayals. We can bring in archaeological evidence to try and help. And then sort of leaving it to the listener, because oftentimes there's nothing better we have there to say, reality was likely something like this. It was likely different. It's gone through this storytelling process. I really like your phrasing of this mythologization process, that a lot of the sagas are really that. They're the settlement myths of Iceland, based on something that probably historically happened. But, it's like George Washington and the cherry tree is the way I tend to think of those stories. And so I just always try in the show to be as open and straightforward as I can about, here are the things we know really happened. If this is coming from a contemporary source written down in England or Ireland or something, we can probably trust that more. It has its own problems, but at least it's contemporary. The sagas are stories about the past that were current in the early Middle Ages. And then archaeology, which is our sort of other main source. We can be very confident that these items were in use during the time period, but our interpretation of them, how we think about them, that in itself goes through a whole lens of our, modern understanding of the world.
Isn't it great when you're able to find those connections, maybe in the theme of a saga with other stories that were going around at a time? You kind of get a glimpse of what humans were doing at that period through it. Like, for me, that's one of my favorite things, like on our podcast, is when we cover a myth and then I can go and find a very similar myth, like in some other part of the world. It's like, okay, there's something here that like humans across the world are dealing with.
Yes, I'd say there's almost nothing that makes me happier when you discover that you're like, oh, this is an experience that was definitely happening, and you can see it echoed in different places and different times. Oftentimes you can even see, echoes of it today with issues that we're grappling with. And I think that sort of universality with all of the weird details wrapped around them is just so satisfying.
Yeah, and when you come across these connections, what do you do on your show to maybe bring in? Do you ever bring in anything outside of the strict Viking realm in terms of details from that aren't exactly just the Vikings? Do you ever bring that into your show?
Yes, absolutely. So the sort of two axes that I've tended to do this, and I've done time more, so I'll start there. Of another thing that sort of, when I started the show, was like, oh, Vikings, it'll be the Viking Age. That's the name of the podcast. Great. Very quickly became aware that artificial time boxing of, from 800-ish to 1100-ish just really wasn't sufficient if you're to, do the best to try to understand what was going on starting much earlier. So you can see, obviously, mostly we have archaeological evidence, but you can see from the Bronze Age, the way people are living in Scandinavia has echoes of the way they were during the Viking Age. The Longhouse is a great example of this, that the form and function of it changes over time, but pretty much from the late Stone Age even, people in Scandinavia were living in longhouses as their primary dwelling. And that's super interesting and is just this long-running cultural theme. Similarly, then when you start to get some of the Roman sources talking about the German barbarians, you can see echoes there. There's echoes in Tacitus where he's talking about an assembly that sounds a hell of a lot like descriptions we have in the sagas of how things functioned. And obviously there's 1,000 years of history separating those. They're not going to be exactly the same, but you can see these institutions that were there and have this incredibly long history in the North. And to appreciate that, you have to go beyond the Viking Age and go beyond sort of the Viking world, even as broad as that is. Things that were happening in Carolingian Europe had direct impacts on what was going on in Scandinavia, why people were going raiding. I've been researching sort of in the background for a while the Vikings in the East, and I've found some of the best analogies to actually be some of the interactions between French fur trappers and First Peoples in Canada. Provide some really interesting analogies about how this trade might have functioned, and really just kind of being open to that and, never drawing direct lines, never saying this is exactly the same as the other thing, but broadening your understanding to say this is how these sorts of things might function.
Yeah, on a couple of levels, I think we can appreciate that because, first of all, the parallels to different mythological traditions in our case, or historical sources, we certainly dive into that sometimes. Finding those parallels, it's always like, yeah, here's a common thread that actually works, and it can inform what the story is trying to say, and that's always valuable. But the other things that you mentioned, like prior to the Viking Age, the Bronze Age type stuff, and the source of Tacitus, we enjoy whenever we get to reference Tacitus because it's just such his Germania book is just such an interesting source, but it's also so old and so far removed from what it's actually talking about, describing, that it's I won't go so far as to say it's a grain of salt type situation, but it's definitely on the level of we get to talk about the implications with a fair bit of license and freedom because it's not necessarily going to be 100% accurate to what was actually there. It's just a way of pointing us in the right direction. And I think that's what we try and do as well here, is that we use these parallels to try and inform what we're discussing, which I think it sounds like that's roughly what you're doing as well.
Yes, and just to try to, when you're working with the, the period we're in, the sort of absolutes, the set of things you can say are true is so limited that anything you can do to help put context around that, help the way you think about it, I think has a lot of value. As long, again, as, you just put all the caveats around it, trusts that an audience and yourself are not going to make crazy conclusions. I think it's incredibly valuable.
Just rewinding a bit, you'd mentioned that the Eastern Vikings, you saw some similarities between them and the French fur trappers in Canada. And as being a Canadian podcast, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that? I'm very fascinated to know about the similarities.
Yes. So first of all, let me follow my own license here and put all of the caveats of, I haven't sort of dived terribly deeply into this yet, but sort of in the initial period of Scandinavian expansion east, we see these trading sites pop up. The most famous is Staria Ladoga, which is just in Western Russia, just off the Gulf of Finland. And one of the big ways that we trace what happened in the East is through coin finds. So coins from the caliphates made their way north and were, we think, traded for furs at these trading posts in Western Russia. And then from there, the silver made its way west to Scandinavia and beyond. And so we have tens and tens of thousands of coins from the Arab caliphates in the Middle East floating around Northern Europe, which is just crazy and wonderful. And I think one of the coolest parts about the Viking Age. I was reading about sort of the origins of these trading places. And we think what the best guess right now, because a lot of them don't have coin finds in their earliest layers. And so we think that initially, driven by demand for furs from continental Europe primarily, we had people from Scandinavia heading east, interacting with the native people who lived in these areas, who were actually probably doing most of the trapping based on the evidence that we have. And you had sort of this, it's not really a frontier situation. That's just sort of where my mind goes because I'm thinking about the analogy, where you have people from Scandinavia interacting, living, trading with native peoples who were trapping these animals, skinning them. They were trading a lot of the same times, a lot of similar materials you see almost 1,000 years later of, trading beads and iron items for furs and then bringing those down south to continental Europe. And I read a fascinating paper that was basically just drawing some of those analogies of saying, we don't actually know what happened because all we have is archaeology. But here's a sort of similar situation of French trappers coming into an area they're unfamiliar with, working with locals, trading with locals for a similar commodity. A lot of the things being exchanged were the same. And maybe this is a way for us to understand how those interactions might have functioned.
Oh, that's neat. So yeah, it's definitely kind of a signpost and like, this is how it could have been or similar to this, rather than saying, it's exactly the same. It's just, it gives us an idea of how it could have gone possibly, because in this part of the world, in a similar situation, this is how it went down. So no, that's a fascinating comparison.
Yeah. No, my mind was kind of blown when it hadn't occurred to me. And then I read this paper and was like, whoa, that's so cool. I love this.
Yeah, we enjoy whenever we get those moments on our show, making a connection. And sometimes that connection happens live and one of us will blow the other's mind or vice versa. And it's just, yeah, those are good moments. So maybe on another note here, something that we like to ask is, how has exploring all this stuff affected you in your life or the way you see the world? And maybe to you specifically, how has exploring Viking Age history impacted you?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things, and I actually touched on a little bit with the the coin finds, is I find myself continually surprised, and I think that says more about me than it does about the information itself, of just how complex and interconnected the world of the Vikings was. And that I think, that was one of the things that interested me about it to begin with, but I don't think I had ever really internalized interconnectivity, these global connections feel like such a modern thing. And as I've dug into the Viking Age more, as I've spent time reading the sagas, looking at this history, just the sort of vast scope of the connections and the really global scope of all of this. I think Vikings, primarily operated within Europe, but were connected through trade networks and in some cases, personal journeys with people spanning the globe, quite literally. And I think that's something that studying the Vikings always does a good job reminding me that this is the case, that it's a false narrative to think that the past was any simpler than the present. Things have always been complex. People have always been interconnected. And I think I love that I am reminded of that every day that I pick up a book and read about this stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And the effect of reading these stories is, of course, subjective, but getting to dig into these historical sources and then build from that, and then to do something like you're doing with the show, with the podcast, it's really good. And it's really awesome to see that you have such a following that is similarly interested in just this kind of history as well. And I'm curious, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to talk about that you're working on with your show, or maybe not even with the show exactly, but anything else you're working on?
Yeah, so I am sort of in the process of wrapping up our series on Gunnhild and powerful women right now. I'm very excited about that. Hopefully we'll, in the next month or so, be wrapping that up. And don't really have anything to pitch because I'm still sort of figuring out what the next set of stories will be to talk about. I began a little bit of a series on Vikings in the East, mostly setting the background for what Middle Sweden was like. And so I'm definitely eager to return there, talk about some of the stuff discussed of, trading and all of these interactions that were taking place in the Baltic. And then sort of on a different note, back to this idea of sort of before the Vikings. Throughout my research for a couple of different topics now, have sort of acquired bits and pieces of what I think will be a really interesting exploration of Scandinavia during the Roman Iron Age. So it's from about 1 CE ish to the 400s or 500s, and that's sort of this period where we see a lot of the political and economic organization that we recognize from the Viking Age take shape in Scandinavia. And so really talking about and exploring that, how that happened, Scandinavia's interaction with Rome is super interesting. So I'm not quite sure where we're going to go yet, but I have some good breadcrumbs out there and just going to kind of see what path draws me down.
Yeah, those topics sound super interesting. It'll be interesting to see which way you go first, because I imagine you'll hit both at some point. But
that's the hope. We just keep going. Even if it's one episode a month at the most.
Right. And I mean, that's the funny thing is that I'm sure you're never going to run out of material. We certainly always have that realization that whenever we're done a particular series, we've only really finished like a mini series, but we're pretty near winding up the mythological portion of the Poetic Edda. And that's pretty significant. And we just realize like there's so much more to cover, and digging into this stuff, digging into this history, these stories, all of this stuff, it all fits together, and it's awesome that we get to share this with our listeners and get to explore these stories in a way that that people actually like to listen to and tune into and join us for the journey. And so I'm glad to hear that you've got a lot of great threads, and I certainly hope that your show continues to produce such excellent content that you have been producing so far.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And same goes to you guys. I am also very excited for if you're getting close to the mythological portion of the Poetic Edda. That's huge.
Yeah, only a few poems to go, and then we're into the historical portion, but maybe we're at our own crossroads, whether we'll do something else before that or whatnot. So we've certainly got some of that, but the topics that you're looking at as far as what you might do next is really interesting. And are you still looking to continue the format where you're focusing to one area for a few episodes at a time?
Yes. So I think that is what I've sort of settled on, of what works the best for me, sort of prevents me getting burned out on one topic, is doing sort of smaller chunks of episodes, and they might be interspersed with one another, but it just helps prevent burnout of reading and thinking about the same topic day in and day out. Can, at least I find, I get to a point where I'm like, oh God, I can't think about this anymore. And then episodes don't happen. So I'm going to try and keep myself to like 4 or 5 episode chunks.
For sure. No, research burnout is a real thing.
Very much so.
So I think before we let you go here, would you like to tell our listeners where they can get a hold of you and find your show?
Absolutely. So easiest way to find the show is just search Viking Age Podcast on whatever podcast app it is you use. If you enjoy the show, leave a rating and a review. Have to include that plug. And then best place to find us on social media or anywhere else is to go to the website, vikingagepodcast.com. And there's links on there for all of our social media, or just search Viking Age Podcast anywhere, and we show up.
Awesome.
Well, excellent. It's been awesome talking to you, Lee, and everything that you got going on with your show sounds very exciting, and we'll certainly have to, we'll be following you closely in all your updates, and in the future, when you got anything else going on, we'd love to have you back on.
Yeah, that would be absolutely fantastic. This has been a real joy, and I'm a big fan of your show, so I'm just really happy to be here. Thank you, guys.
Well, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. We're big fans of yours as well. And again, thank you for paving the way for us. You're definitely one of the pioneers. You and Saga thing, you definitely did a lot of the legwork for us getting this this community together for sure.
I'm just happy it's actually grown into a community. That's been in the past year or so has been really, really kind of wonderful. That it's kind of me and Saga thing for a while, and now there's just sort of this explosion of different people doing fantastic work, and it's been really satisfying to see and listen and learn.
Definitely, it's been great to get to one, and now I think we've talked to pretty well everyone in this little community, and so that's been awesome for us as well, getting to talk to such knowledgeable people, yourself included there. So thank you again for joining us, Lee. It's been a great time talking with you.
Excellent. Bye, guys.
Well, thanks again, Lee. Thank you for joining us. It was a great conversation. And yeah, thank you again for joining us.
Absolutely. We had a great time. It's always good to talk to other people in our little Viking verse. And lots of interesting stuff there. And I think everyone who listens will enjoy that.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, be sure to take a look at Lee's show, Viking Age Podcast, and of course, all of his social media information and website will be in the description. Okay, I think that's just about it for us for today. But just to recap, we are sponsored by Grimfrost, and we are just thrilled to be associated with them, get to tell you about them. They are our favorite source for Norse and Viking products. Based in Sweden, they have a vast selection of historical Viking reproductions, as well as contemporary products inspired by Viking Age culture, and they do ship worldwide, just like the Vikings used to. And just like our show, they aim to build a bridge between the past and the present, bringing relevant parts of the Old Norse culture into today's world. That really is just all that we're about, so we're just thrilled to be partnered with them.
Absolutely. I'm so happy that we're sponsored by Grimfrost, because I know we've both been big fans of theirs from long before this podcast started. So to have someone like Grimfrost behind us it's kind of a dream come true. It's really amazing.
It is, absolutely. And some of our favorite products of theirs include their great shirts, which we've been sporting on our recent episodes, if you've seen. And their beard care products are really just excellent, beard oils and stuff, but also cool combs and stuff like that. They also have drinking horns, which is just always an awesome thing to have around. There's nothing cooler than showing up to a party with a drinking horn. And you can even show up with a drinking horn for the whole party if you want to. You fill that up once, you won't need to fill it again. And check out their website, grimfrost.com, to see everything they have available.
Absolutely. And they've also been kind enough to provide us with our intro and outro music. So yeah, check that out. They've got their own label, so you can download some of their artists' music, and it's really good stuff. Like, awesome stuff.
Absolutely. And that music is, the track is Talk by Folka Bortafur Nordvin from the album Sagnamadur. So we'll have that listed in the description as well below. So
yeah, definitely check that out.
And of course, the number one way you can support the show is on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/northernmyths, you can find our Patreon page. Every little bit of support goes towards making the show even better, towards upgrades for our equipment, our software, and every little bit goes towards that goal of making the show as best as we possibly can. And in turn, we try and give as much value as possible to our supporters, including early access to episodes. Basically, as soon as I'm done editing the episodes, I upload it to Patreon, so you get it a little bit early. And we try and do a little bit of behind the scenes updates for the show, as far as what we're up to, any news for the show, what we have coming up. We let our patrons know first in a little sort of blog kind of thing. So that's what we can do. And we also are open to suggestions. Any way we can improve it or add even more value, we're certainly open to that. And we have some plans that we're hoping to do in the future for the Patreon. And of course, you can also support the show by getting in touch with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Northern Myths or Northern Myths Podcast. On Twitter, we're personally North Myth Luke and North Myth Dan. And if you share, subscribe, any of those things, write reviews, those are all great ways to support the show and just help us out a little bit. And every little bit helps. 5-star review on iTunes is, of course, one of the most helpful things for us, gets us in front of even more people. And if you want to go onto our YouTube channel and subscribe there, that's another great way you can help us to grow, even if you only listen to the podcast on your phone or iTunes or something like that. If you go onto our YouTube channel, that's a great way to support us there. And of course, the Patreon is the number one way you can support us if you want to do so monetarily. The other thing we do have available, though, is we have a web shop with t-shirts and mugs and things like that. And we also have a list of recommended books on our website, which is linked to Amazon through the Amazon affiliate program. So if you purchase anything through there on our recommended books, a little bit goes towards us and it does not cost anything extra to you. We just get a little bit of a percentage of each sale. So those are all ways to support the show if you would like. Am I forgetting anything, Dan?
Well, I think that's most of it, but there is one thing, and it's the most important thing, and that's to go and find the myth you're living.
This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thank you very much for listening.